Welcome to ABA On Call. Join myself, Rick Kubina. Behavior analysis is a science of behavior. And Doug Kostewicz.
Focus on the individual, and you're going to see focus on behavior.
For thought-provoking conversation. Hey everybody, would you like to get a CEU for this episode? Listen closely for the announcement of 3 secret words delivered throughout the episode. Take note of those words and we will tell you where to go to get your CEU when the show is over. Hello everyone and welcome back to ABA On Call. Today, Doug, we are going to embark on a 3-episode journey. We haven't done this before.
We have
it's
not.
New. It's exciting.
Mm-hmm. It's like the original trilogy, not the
thank you.
Not the other 6. This is just original, right?
That's right. I was looking for that reference, and you came through in shining colors this morning.
Without any prep work, I was ready.
So we're going to talk about, what could take 3 episodes. Well, honestly, we could take a whole season with this content, but this will be fascinating discussion, and it's talking about how can you 10x, this is what we're calling it, how do you 10x your clinical and research outcomes? Now, that's a pretty bold claim. When you talk about 10xing something, that means you're doing it 10 times better than you were before.
Right.
And there could be many ways
that's worth it.
But we're just going to focus in on something that you and I have spent a lot of time in our career, and that is on the data analysis interpretation side. So let's just jump into this. Well, I guess we could take one more second and talk about what these 3 episodes will look like. We're going to introduce in this segment what we mean, how we're going to do this. Then we're going to talk about level, because we're going to be talking about visual analysis and quantitative analysis of your data. Next episode after this, we'll talk about acceleration, and then we'll talk about variability. Maybe not in that order exactly for those next 2. Maybe we'll switch it up a little bit to be fun, but we'll see how that goes.
Sounds exciting. I'm ready to go.
All right. And the other thing that I'm going to say to everyone is we're going to start using some some static pictures to supplement our conversation. So those of you who are watching us on YouTube, now you get more than just these 2 handsome faces. Now you also get some visuals. And for those of you who are listening to us, we will put up in our show notes a slide that you can just download. So all the content that we have here, everything that we're going to show, if you'd like to see this later, then download it and check it out. Without further ado, I'm going to share my screen here, and hopefully I get this right. This is our first segment, so the slides are working. And Doug, I want to help ground this conversation, and that is by stating that when we do visual analysis, or when we do any kind of analysis on time series displays, there's basically 2 types of graphs we can use. We can use linear graphs, we can use ratio graphs. And I'll put up a couple images of what these are and we can talk about them. But the point here is not only can we have linear graphs and ratio graphs, those linear graphs can be non-standard, those linear graphs can be standard, those ratio graphs can be non-standard, and those ratio graphs can be standard. So here are things that you and our audience would be familiar with. Now, if you're describing this, Doug, how would you describe these non-standard linear graphs? What makes them non-standard?
Well, so first thing you want to look is along on all of these. The reason why we're talking about time series is time's going to be along the x-axis. So on each of these, it's showing time. Some are showing I think maybe days, there's sessions, but now along the y-axis is some quantitative measure. So it could be percent of intervals, etc. So when you're looking at non-standard, what you see is the distance between these numbers are different on each graph. the widths and lengths of these graphs are different. They're compressed, they're pushed forward, pushed away from each other. We can stretch it. So when you're talking non-standard linear graph, everything can be maneuvered around to fit whatever you want to show. So you could have a large disk, and that can be within the three graphs themselves. So you have multiple stacked, multiple baselines. Those baselines could be changed. Those axes can be changed. The distance between tick marks can be changed. That epitomizes the non-standard linear graph.
Yeah. So everything you said, and for those of you who aren't seeing this live right now, just imagine the last time you've been to a conference or anywhere, you open up a journal, everything is non-standard here. This is an example of a standard linear graph. There aren't many in our field. This comes out of an early Java, I think it's 70 or 71, and Jim Johnson said, hey, what if we have a standard linear graph? And I think he was inspired by the standard acceleration chart, which we'll talk about here in a second. But you can see that this was an offer or a proposal for everyone to be able to be on the same page. Now, just as Doug was saying with ratio graphs, you can have non-standard ratio graphs. And I guess I should say real quickly, Doug, the difference between a linear graph and a ratio graph is just with that vertical axis or y-axis scaling. Rather than being scaled in equal intervals or in a linear fashion, which is why we call them linear graphs, they're scaled with equal ratios or equal proportions. And real quick, an example of a standard ratio graph is the standard acceleration chart, which maybe some people in the audience have heard of. So we spent that time sharing those graphs to lay it all out for, how do you 10x your outcomes? Well, let's just start off let me ask this question for you, Doug. If you were going to do a visual analysis and then a quantitative analysis, what's the difference just between a linear graph and a ratio graph? What can you do on the one that you really can't do on the other?
Well, what you're going to see, first, getting to the non-standard, standard is a whole nother issue. But like you said, the linear, right, it's going to show just an adding and subtracting of behavior, right? You're just going, when you do one more, two more, three more. And if you're trying to do any type of comparison, so if you've got a behavior such as, let's say reading, and you have corrects at 200 and 300, and then you have errors at 1 and 2, putting that on one graph compresses your errors, even though 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 errors could be very important to your understanding of that. But you having the linear nature, the add subtract, it compresses those errors so that you don't see, and it looks like you've got a lot here and not a lot here. Whereas with a ratio, you're looking at the comparison between the two. So you're seeing those changes related rather than just in an add subtract format.
Yeah. So Doug, you hit upon one of the major factors that when you look at, if you want to have your clinical outcomes, your research outcomes, just taking a linear view of the world versus taking a truly proportional multiply divide view of the world is incredibly different. And it's so all of us have been through the COVID pandemic, and a lot of the graphs were ratio graphs. Right. And I don't know if people picked up on that, but the reason why is because for those reasons that you just said, and even more. We could spend an entire season talking about these issues, but just to start off with that one simple reason, yes, it is the way that the data are transformed. Mm-hmm. Another question. Yeah. Tell me very quickly, what are the differences in terms of being able to quantify the data in a general sense?
Well, I'm gonna push that back to you because there's what I want to address is that standard side. So I'm gonna let you take that one on.
I'll talk real quickly about the quantification. A lot of people now in our field are bringing in big statistics to try to quantify our data, which is the exactly wrong way to go. What we need is a graph that quantifies everything.
Right.
You want to quantify how fast something's growing? Boom, ratio chart does it. You want to quantify how much variability you have? Boom, ratio graph does it. Anything you want to quantify can be done. You can get statistics from a ratio graph, and it's really wonky if you try to do that in a linear graph. So that's the second reason in the second component that gets at this 10xing. Last one, I'll push it back to you, Doug. Tell us about standard and non-standard.
So you've seen enough graphs in the field, in journals, and when you have non-standard graphs, you spend you don't realize that your eyes get tricked because what you're seeing, you're not used to. You're seeing the graphs, as we mentioned, changing, the scaling changing, even two graphs right next to each other. If you're not hypersensitive, you'll see this one go to 10 and this one go to 2, and you'll see movement because our eyes are geared towards looking where that line is going. Where's the trend going? What's the variability? But when you get to mess with all those other features of the graph, it can send a very different message. When you have standardization, then you don't have to worry about construction. You get to look at the data through the same lens every time. Now, we need to understand what that data are, but the presentation of that data remains consistent because the template is consistent.
Yeah. Listen, anybody out there, if you happen to be a student and you're a master's student, an undergrad or a grad, you're looking for thesis, honors thesis, dissertation, you can make your entire career on transforming the field. We said that this is 10x, but how valuable would it be for anybody? And I just want you to think about this real quickly. You can't quantify anything. Now all of a sudden you can quantify that. Is that 10x more?
Wait,
and then the standards thing, Doug, that you said, all of these mistakes are being made on the non-standard side. All of these exaggerations are being made by people stretching out their. Is that worth 10x?
No.
I mean, and then of course the linear part that you led off with, this transformation and this looking at, so our eyes aren't fooled. That's a real thing. So we could go on and talk about this, but this is the framework through which we're going to talk about the rest of these three things and really just diving a lot deeper into each one of these different facets of visual analysis.
Well, that brings us to our first word, I think, right?
Yes, we are there.
Our first secret word is data. Okay, Rick. For this second section, we're going to dive into the first of the three aspects of interpreting graphs, and that's going to be level. Can you share your slide here?
Yes, sir.
So level can be thought about a variety of ways within the field, and first thing we're just going to do is look at three different ways. So this first level, as you can see, if you're watching on online, you'll see there's two conditions, a baseline and an intervention condition, and there's about 12 data points, 6 in each. And the first one takes into account one version of level, and that is called the impact of change, looking at the last 3 data points of baseline and the first 3 data points of intervention, taking the mean score of those, and then the distance between the two. So you're looking at what's that effect over those 6 sessions or 6 measurements. Then you can also look at level just at the last data point of a condition and the first data point of the next condition as an impact. So the distance between those two. And another way to look at level is the entirety of each condition. So for example, taking a mean score of baseline and then a mean score of intervention and the distance between those two. So Rick, those are 3 versions of level in interpreting. How does this become impacted by the variety of data displays that we have, standard, non-standard, linear, and ratio.
Yeah. So that was a good description. For people, depending on how you want to use this, if you're looking at the immediacy of your impact, this gets back to the three things that we just talked about. Number one, there's going to be a transformation when you look at this. So when you're doing visual analysis, and this is probably, of all the things that we're going to talk about in this series, which will be like you can detect it because, as you pointed out, there's different ways of doing the level. You can take different means. We didn't even talk about all the different ways. There's 10 different means or more that you could take. We're not going to even get into that. But when you look at the means from one to the next, it will look different based off of what kind of graph you're using. And it all gets back to adding and subtracting and multiplying and dividing. And we'll, in the next segment, we're going to talk about how valuable that is and how we wrote a paper about this very topic and how you could use this with functional analysis. So looking at it is one way, but a second way, Doug, would be quantifying it. And we talked about being able to quantify things and not quantify things. If you had a level in one condition that was at 1, and then you had another, let's say it went up to 4. If you were quantifying that in an add subtract way, it would be 1, it would be 4 minus 1, or however so it'd be 4 more or 3 more.
3 more.
And if you were multiplying it, it would be times 4.
Right.
And that gets really important because when we start looking at the magnitude of the impact, the immediacy, or overall, that number would have a huge impact. So, think about a reading example and think about how this might tie into, or even behavior change. You've done a lot of work with behavior change. What's the difference between subtracting something and multiplying something or dividing something?
Right.
It's huge.
It's so big, but more importantly, it gets away from that notion of plus, right? Adding 3 or adding 4. When you place it on these charts, remember, because again, we're getting back to that notion of you don't know what you're looking at all the time. So if a level change, it might look big, but when you look at your scaling, right, it's 0.01, 0.02, 0.03. So your change is the tiniest amount, but you get to rescale it so that it looks like a big change. Because level, first and foremost, you look for that change. So that kind of messes with you a little bit, right? The eyeball looks for that change. Well, you put the quantification in, you see it's a change of 0.1. Is that meaningful? We don't know. You put that information in a ratio, as you mentioned, and now it's a times something or a divide by something. And you think about doing something 4 times more, 5 times more. That's so much more meaningful than doing something 0.2 more or 0.4 more.
So you're blending in two things here.
Yes,
you're talking about that standard versus non-standard, and you're talking about the quantification. And that's a mic drop moment, Doug. That would transform the entire field. I remember looking at, take whatever journal, like our audience, what is your most respected journal in the field? You think about your JABA, you think about JAB, they've been around a long time. And I remember looking at a JABA article, and there were like 3 graphs, and one was scaled just like you said. It was from like 1 to 3, and the other one was from 0 to 40. And they were using visual analysis to try to make sense of this. But if you were going to mathematically look at, we're just essentially playing this game with ourselves where we're trying to impress each other like, oh, look at how special this is. But the numbers don't lie. And because we're doing this, and because everybody is getting together and saying, hey, let's all be on the same, let's all agree to just, everybody can make their own graphs. Let's forget the quantitative analysis and let's just pretend like we're going to use this visual analysis that shifts from person to person. And Doug, it's a mess. So
it is a mess.
just so 10x everything, maybe 100x. I mean, honestly, I don't know what that number is, but it's really frustrating when you think about where we are and where we could be.
So I guarantee you're probably going to say this the next 2 times as well as we're talking about this, but we are limited to a subjective analysis versus when you use effective data displays allowing an objective analysis. And just because we put numbers on graphs doesn't mean that our analysis is related to those numbers. You become very subjective. So that plays right into that 10x analysis, that you're not going to be swayed by the picture. You can use the picture and the statistics it's generating to then sway.
Yes. And I want to start throwing some amens in here. That is exactly right. How can you take a field, and it's hard to, I think at some level it's hard to admit that we have this problem because a lot of people aren't talking about it. We have this subjectivity, but honestly, if you go back and look at the data and all the studies that look at how unreliable visual analysis is, it's not us saying this. There's all these other researchers in this line that have pointed out, we have a problem with visual analysis. We're just saying, look, we can fix that problem in a way, in a fashion that would be so much better. So for all of you listening, if you are inspired by this, start looking at, the ratio graph and maybe start doing it. Like, Doug, how would you recommend? Well, no, I'm not going to go in that question. That brings us down a whole nother topic.
Right.
But let's continue talking about the differences between these two. And certainly with level, like, do you remember you and I know you remember, did a study.
Yep.
And we looked at just Java, and we looked at, we analyzed what was the most commonly occurring tactic that people use with visual analysis. What was it?
Level.
It was level.
Right.
So if that's true, Doug, and we're doing level basically by eye, everything you said about all the subjectivity is right there.
Right.
So not only, yeah.
No, you go ahead.
I would say not only are people not using the numbers, they're using their opinion, but it's visually different in every graph.
Yeah. I mean, how many times have we read an article that says level increased, level decreased?
Yay.
So, yay. Well, that brings us to our second word, and that is mean.
Well, Doug, I'm taking a deep breath here, and I might just get riled up again. I can't help myself because this is so important. We're talking about 10xing our field, and we all come into behavior analysis because we're excited about the power of behavior change, and we could even do more. So that's why I get so excited about this. But let me share my screen once more, and I will, I'll describe this to our listeners. And we're going to talk this last segment about how this level in general just can be used in clinical practice. And I am going to start off by showing our abstract to a paper that you and I published with our good colleague, Sal Ruiz. And in this study, what we did, and this will be in the show notes for those of you that want to download this and read this article, is we took a bunch of articles that were written in Java, and we took all of the values from their charts. And these are, by the way, these are all on functional analysis. In maybe we had 10 articles or 11, I can't remember the exact number, but we looked at all the data, and then we put it on our ratio graph. And then we looked at, is there any distinguishing factors? Like what jumps out at us? And here's what we found. We discovered that if you have a function, everybody in Java that was doing this, almost everybody had what's called a ×2 difference. In other words, that line, that average line that you talked about earlier, when you draw it through your data points, if you take the average of that, to show a function, the average line from another condition, like let's say you're comparing play versus escape, that play condition would be 2 times greater, not +2, Doug.
Right.
2 times greater. And again, this is something that I think is just astounding. Mm-hmm. If more people jumped on this data, could we actually, through our field, have this statistical analysis that we're using just because we've changed the way we're viewing data and say, yes, we now know what a function is based off of this analysis. It's got to be ×2 greater or more. Mm-hmm. So this was, I think, a really exciting study.
Way exciting. Again, it's taking something that's been generally left to the subjective analysis and trying to advance the science more towards a quantification of the data without using any type of inferential statistics or anything outside of a visual display that garners those statistics as part of the package.
Yeah, exactly. So this is just one example, mm-hmm. taking functional analysis. Whenever you have data and it can fit in a ratio, and let me say this too, we didn't say this earlier, but no, we're not talking about every single thing in the world has to be put. We're talking about time series analyses. Like if you're doing a scatter plot or looking for a heat map, you don't need to put it on this graph. Mm-mm. If you have a pie chart or whatever, you don't need to put it on this graph. So we're just talking about time series data.
Okay, so that's one use of level. As we're thinking about this from a research and clinical perspective, what's another reason we might be gearing ourselves towards using level? Usually we're so concerned with the individual's behavior change. Usually there may be a behavior identified for reduction as well as some behavior identified for acquisition. And we're looking at when we don't have the intervention in place, we do have the intervention in place. But what we sometimes don't take into account is when you're looking at the level of these behaviors, looking past the individual to the society, to the settings, to the people that they'll be interacting with. So, for example, when we're targeting, say, we're trying to reduce out-of-seat behavior for a student. Well, in most classroom settings, kids are out of seat generally a little bit. So aiming for 0 doesn't make sense. But if we know what that level is for the other kids, then we have a goal so that student, which is a social validity concern, finding out where that student kind of needs to be for us to feel like they're going to fit into the realm that they're working in. Also, we need to take into account what the world is doing for acquisition as well, because that level determines perhaps that behavior meeting with those natural contingencies to increase the generalization concerns for that individual. So level not only has that, and then we're not talking about the level of change, we're talking about that overall level within a condition. Right. Where does that individual relate to the world? So, we do something 4 times more, that's great. But if that 4 times more doesn't bring us to where the world is, it's unlikely that behavior, when left on its own, is going to meet with the natural contingencies once treatment ends. So once you start to get these standard levels, then we know what we can be shooting for and even surpass, because over time we're going to rescind a little bit, but that way we can practice, we can aim for things that are higher or lower in comparison to others. So there's a core use of level that we don't always think about.
Yeah, Doug, you're really getting at social validity.
Right.
That is such a foundational concept. And with level, we could have that. Like I've seen this in some early childhood settings. Like I remember as a grad student, they talk about ecological validity. And what that's getting at is, what is like, I mean, it was such a good example. Kids are out of their seat. Siblings fight with one another. Like we're not going to live in a world where it's the complete absence of, that's just not normal stuff. So what is normal? And then if we start looking at, like I remember very early on in my career when I was helping our student teachers at Penn State, and we have this behavior project, and you have to pick a child who has a behavior. And so the student asked the teacher, "Hey, can you give me a student that has a problem?" She picked this one student who had ADHD, and she said, "Oh yeah, he's out of his seat all the time." You know what she did? Exactly what you said. She measured across the week how often the kids were like getting off their mat and moving around. Guess what she found? This kid was no different from anyone else. But this teacher has this mindset, oh, ADHD kid, this kid's a problem. And that really matters. And if we're taking the level and we're putting it on this chart and we're quantifying it and we have these standards, this could be a way of transforming what we do.
And it's setting specific. So like you said, there's that classroom, but there may be other classrooms where getting out of a seat is even more often, and it's actually okay to do it, or calling out, or things to that effect. Yeah, teachers definitely identify problems and then want to reduce it to zero. And that is unfair to the child. That is not taking into account what's going on in the world, or so on and so forth. So that notion of social validity is so important, but we get laser focused so often on, I need to reduce a behavior, I need to improve a behavior, and I'm just showing change and I'm done. And that's not enough.
How cool would it be, Doug, if all of a sudden, people took that message, started looking at where they are, started looking at the overall condition level, and then when you talk about the changes, oh, you are 2 times above or 3 times, because if you're only a little bit above, then it's probably not really an issue. Maybe it's more of an annoyance, or
Right.
maybe it's even not. Maybe it's within this band, and then we can truly take that step where we're quantifying the things, and this is completely objective. And that's got to be at least 10 times better than what we're doing now.
I got one even better for you. Ready for this?
I'm ready.
What if you realize that your kid needs to improve by 5x? Then you can evaluate the interventions that are going to push that child 5x to meet the natural contingencies, or divide by 6, so that you can't afford to use a ineffective intervention, or one that's going to work too slowly, or one that's only going to move it 1 or 2x. I mean, that when you start to think about putting those interventions, so you're combining where's the level I need to get to, where's the level at, and what's going to move me. So if I need to move it in 2 years versus 2 months, that gets
Doug, I'm going to give that a chef's kiss.
Oh, there we go.
Beautiful.
Awesome.
Just beautiful. That's absolutely right. It's spot on. And we could be there if we start taking this very simple shift of moving from linear to ratio. And of course, not just any ratio, but let's have a standard ratio. Well, that will bring us to our third secret word, which is ratio. And Doug, that will also bring us to the close of this segment.
Yes.
So on behalf of my good colleague, Doug Kostewicz, I would like to thank you all for joining us. And I hope you were intrigued by this and you join us for the part 2 of the series next week or next month, or whenever the time frame is for you, for ABA On Call.
Thanks for watching this episode of ABA On Call. To get your CEU, follow the link and instructions below the video. You can enjoy the program again there, or you can go straight to the attendance verification quiz. Just enter the secret words and pay the CEU fee to generate your certificate.